here has been raised in a Western mindset in the context of there is property, there are lines that you cannot cross, certain Western values that don't directly align with traditional indigenous values. And I'd like to put a little disclaimer that most of the topics that I will be discussing are not true necessarily for all tribal nations. We are not a monolith by any means. Even within my own tribe, I am known to be a little on the more radical side of thinking when it comes to the environment. But so yeah, I'd like to just make that little disclaimer. But so traditional indigenous teachings and values and philosophies are often in contrary to Western teachings. Some of the values that we hold very dear are very much in common to some of the Western ones. We just look at it a little bit differently. So to start it from a little historic standpoint, we traditionally were very semi-nomadic in the sense that in certain seasons we would be on the coast, others, when it gets a little colder, we would go more inland. Today, that's just not possible. Ever since colonization and reservations, we have been restricted to one specific location. That makes it very difficult and in some instances impossible for us to practice traditional cultural practices. Another historic standpoint, and I apologize if it gets a little too heavy at times, but we do not have necessarily the best relationship with our surrounding towns. There are individual, and I have no ill will towards these individuals because they themselves did nothing negative to us necessarily, but there are some families that have that you can trace back to the direct colonial families that did these, for lack of a better word, atrocities to my ancestors. So there's still a little bit of bad blood between the two communities that I will admit gladly has been improving ever since my lifetime. So that is a very positive note. And that can be a little difficult to overcome, especially when dealing with land. And we can get a little bit more into some of those details a little bit later. But with all that said, a lot of the philosophies or indigenous philosophies that I like to practice are heavily influenced by the concept of reciprocity with the land. So we, in traditional indigenous philosophy, we don't own land. If anything, we belong to the land. We are very much land-based people. Mashantucket Pequot, one of the interpretations is people of the shallow waters. So we identify very heavily with the land, and a lot of our language is land-based. So our language, at least at Mashantucket, is still in the infancy of Reconstruction ever since we weren't allowed to use it, but we're now in the process of rebuilding it, and it's very apparent that a lot of the language is used to reference locations or processes that might be witnessed over the course of travels. So reciprocity for and with the land is huge. We consider the land and the water very sacred for that reason, because at the end of the day, the land and water will be here whether we are or not. It was here before us and will be here after us, kind of a situation. So in that context, I just would like to start that as the beginning of our hopefully joint conversation to figure out ways that we can work together. And for those that have already begun that, I would love to eventually hear some feedback on how it's turned out, if it's still continuing, your experiences in that. So thank you for being here and being open-minded to this concept.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. I think what Rahiem just shared could serve as the core of this larger conversation, and also serve as a sort of a scaffolding around it, and something I think that's important to keep in mind as we move forward. So I can speak a little bit about Avalonia and our history and our mission and our purpose, and how our interests overlap and intersect with some of those of the Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation and other indigenous communities that are within our service area. So all of Avalonia's preserves, the 5,000 acres that we steward, whether it's fee-owned or conservation easement, fall within the traditional territory of different indigenous communities. The Mashantucket Pequot Tribal Nation, the Eastern Pequot Tribal Nation, which those two at one point prior to 1637 were one community, as well as the Mohican Indian tribe, as well as possibly other historic communities, but those are the federally acknowledged and state acknowledged tribes. We have yet to reach out and communicate with the Golden Hill Pagusset. They, as we learned this morning, are down in Trumbull, but they also have a much more recent land holding in Colchester. So we don't have any preserves in that area yet, but as we do, we'll use the things that we're learning in these initial conversations to help guide us in those conversations. So one of the things that I think is important to consider is that if you're from Connecticut, if you have a land trust in Connecticut, the land that you are stewarding, whether you own it or whether you just have a responsibility to monitor it, was once another community's land. So a lot of land trusts are thinking about land acknowledgements and putting their policies together, and